In November 1918, Germany signed the armistice that ended World War I, bringing relief to the world but humiliation to a broken empire. The Treaty of Versailles, signed on June 28, 1919, punished Germany harshly, demanding 132 billion gold marks in reparations, stripping its colonies, and limiting its army to just 100,000 men. The once proud military power was left humiliated and disarmed. This humiliation burned deep within the hearts of millions of Germans. The 1920s brought chaos. Hyperinflation turned life into a nightmare. People carried wheelbarrows of worthless marks to buy bread. Families starved, savings vanished, and faith in democracy collapsed. Veterans from the Great War felt betrayed by their own leaders, the so-called November criminals. Out of this anger rose extremism, and among its loudest voices was a failed Austrian artist turned soldier, Adolf Hitler. In 1919, Hitler joined a small radical group in Munich called the German Workers' Party, which he later reshaped into the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis. His charisma and furious speeches electrified crowds, promising revenge, order, and rebirth. He blamed Germany's enemies, particularly Jews and communists, for all suffering, creating a narrative that fed on despair. By 1923, Hitler's ambition exploded into action through the beer hall putsch, a failed coup in Munich. He was arrested and sentenced to prison, but his time behind bars only sharpened his vision. There, he wrote Mein Kampf, outlining his ideology of racial supremacy and dreams of a new German empire, the Third Reich. Released in 1924, Hitler rebuilt his movement patiently, waiting for crisis to strike again. That moment came with the Great Depression of 1929, when the global economy collapsed. Millions of Germans lost their jobs, democracy seemed powerless. Amid this despair, Hitler's message, "Germany will rise again," resonated deeply. On January 30, 1933, through political maneuvering and the desperation of the elite, President Paul von Hindenburg appointed Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. Few realized what that day would mean for the world. From the ashes of defeat, a new force was about to emerge, a war machine fueled by ideology, vengeance, and ambition. This was the dawn of Blitzkrieg, the lightning war, a method of destruction that would soon change the face of modern warfare forever. When Adolf Hitler took power on January 30, 1933, few outside Germany grasped the magnitude of what had begun. In his first speech as Chancellor, Hitler promised peace and order, but behind those words lay a ruthless plan for total control. Within months, the Reichstag fire on February 27, 1933, gave him the perfect excuse to crush all opposition. The next day, the Reichstag fire decree suspended civil liberties, allowing police to arrest anyone without trial. Germany was no longer a democracy, it had become a police state overnight. In March 1933, the Enabling Act gave Hitler absolute power to rule by decree. Political parties were banned, trade unions dissolved, and regional states brought under Nazi authority. The Gestapo, the secret police, was unleashed, spreading fear across the nation. Books were burned, journalists silenced, and schools rewired to teach the gospel of the Führer. The Nazi propaganda machine, led by Joseph Goebbels, turned radio, film, and newspapers into tools of control. Hitler's image was everywhere on walls, posters, and coins portrayed as the savior of Germany. Meanwhile, in secret, Hitler defied the Treaty of Versailles. In 1935, he reintroduced conscription, expanding the army to over 500,000 men. That same year, the Luftwaffe, Germany's new air force, was officially revealed, a bold act of defiance. In 1936, Hitler sent troops into the Rhineland, a demilitarized zone forbidden by the treaty. The world watched but did nothing. Britain and France, haunted by the horrors of World War I, chose appeasement over confrontation. This hesitation emboldened Hitler. In 1936, Germany and Italy formed the Rome-Berlin Axis, and later allied with Japan. By 1938, Hitler's ambitions turned toward Austria. On March 12, 1938, German troops marched into Vienna, in what was called the Anschluss, the unification of Austria and Germany. Crowds cheered in the streets as swastikas filled the city squares. The world again stood silent. Beneath the triumphal parades, however, a far deadlier force was taking shape. German engineers and tacticians, inspired by generals like Heinz Guderian, were developing a new form of warfare, one that combined speed, coordination, and surprise. Tanks, aircraft, and radio communication would strike in perfect harmony. It was warfare reborn for the modern age. By the end of 1938, Germany was no longer the defeated nation of 1919. It was a rearmed, united, and fanatically loyal empire ready to unleash the storm it had forged in secret. The world was sleeping, Germany was awakening, and Blitzkrieg was almost ready. At dawn on September 1, 1939, a thin fog hung over the Polish countryside when the sky erupted with thunder. From above, squadrons of Junkers Ru-87 Stuka dive bombers screamed downward, their sirens wailing a sound designed to terrify. Within minutes, bombs obliterated rail lines, communication posts, and military headquarters. On the ground, waves of Panzer and Panzer II tanks crossed the border, followed by motorized infantry sweeping through villages at lightning speed. This was the world's first glimpse of a new kind of warfare, Blitzkrieg, the Lightning War. Its goal was simple yet devastating: destroy the enemy before they could even respond. Coordinated airstrikes crippled command centers and supply routes, while armored divisions punched deep into enemy lines, cutting off retreat and surrounding entire armies. War was no longer about slow defenses or trench warfare, it was about speed, coordination, and shock. Poland, still relying on outdated cavalry units and World War I tactics, had no chance. Within 2 weeks, its defenses were collapsing. In Berlin, on that same morning, Adolf Hitler stood before the Reichstag and declared, "Since 5:45 a.m., we have been returning fire." A blatant lie, because it was Germany that had launched the attack. 2 days later, on September 3, 1939, Britain and France declared war on Germany. The Second World War had officially begun. Yet, despite their declarations, no real aid reached Poland. The world was still too slow to react. In just 27 days, Poland's resistance was crushed. On September 17th, from the east, the Soviet Union invaded under the secret terms of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, signed only weeks earlier on August 23, 1939. The nation was carved into Germany, took the west. The Soviets seized the east. By October 6, 1939, Poland had ceased to exist. The world was stunned. Blitzkrieg had proven its power. In less than a month, a European nation had vanished from the map. German propaganda celebrated the victory as proof of Aryan superiority and Hitler's military genius. But beneath the triumph, a darker pattern had emerged: a new kind of war. Fast, brutal, and total. From the ashes of Poland, Hitler's eyes now turned west toward France, and the world was beginning to realize this war would not be like the last. The spring of 1940 brought with it a deceptive calm. After the fall of Poland, Europe waited, anxious but motionless. This period became known as the Phony War. For months, nothing seemed to happen. British and French troops dug in along the Maginot Line, a vast network of fortifications stretching along France's border with Germany. They believed it would hold back any invasion, just as trenches had done in World War I, but they were preparing for the wrong kind of war. On May 10, 1940, the silence shattered. Germany launched its Blitzkrieg once again, but this time with terrifying precision. Instead of attacking the heavily fortified Maginot Line, Hitler's armies swept through Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands, drawing the Allied forces northward. It was a masterstroke of deception. While the Allies rushed to defend Belgium, German panzer divisions under General Heinz Guderian struck through the Ardennes forest, a region the French believed was impenetrable. In just 2 days, German tanks broke through and raced toward the English Channel. The Allies were trapped. Nearly 400,000 British and French troops were surrounded near the coastal city of Dunkirk. It seemed like the end, but then came one of the most extraordinary moments in the war: Operation Dynamo. Between May 26 and June 4, 1940, an armada of over 800 civilian boats, fishing vessels, ferries, and private yachts crossed the English Channel under heavy fire to rescue the trapped soldiers. Against all odds, more than 338,000 troops were evacuated to safety in Britain. Winston Churchill would later call it a miracle of deliverance. But France itself was doomed. On June 14, 1940, German troops marched triumphantly into Paris. The City of Light fell without a fight. By June 22, France surrendered. In just 6 weeks, one of the world's most powerful nations had been crushed. The world was in shock. Hitler had achieved what Kaiser Wilhelm never could. Europe now stood under Nazi control. From the Arctic Circle to the Pyrenees, the swastika flew over the continent. Britain stood alone. Across the Channel, the people of England watched the fires of France burn, knowing they were next. By the summer of 1940, Europe had fallen silent under Nazi domination. Only the United Kingdom stood defiant. Across the English Channel, Adolf Hitler watched as British ships and aircraft moved like restless ants. To complete his conquest of Europe, He needed to destroy Britain's defenses. What followed would become the world's first great air campaign, and one of the most decisive battles in human history, the Battle of Britain. On July 10, 1940, the German Luftwaffe launched its first major attacks on British convoys in the Channel. Their goal was clear: to gain air superiority in preparation for an invasion codenamed Operation Sea Lion. Without control of the skies, Hitler could never land his armies on British soil. The Royal Air Force RAF, outnumbered nearly 3 to 1, faced overwhelming odds. But Britain had something the Nazis underestimated: radar technology, brilliant leadership, and unbreakable spirit. Under Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, the RAF organized its fighter command into sectors guided by radar stations along the coast. For the first time in warfare, radar allowed a nation to see its enemy coming before the attack even began. In the skies, British pilots flew the legendary Supermarine Spitfire and Hawker Hurricane, engaging German Messerschmitt Bf-109s in dogfights that would define aerial combat for generations. As the battle intensified through August and September 1940, the Luftwaffe shifted its strategy. Frustrated by the resilience of the RAF, Hitler ordered bombings on London and major cities. The beginning of the Blitz. Night after night, bombs rained down on civilians. Yet, instead of breaking morale, the attacks united the nation. From underground shelters, Londoners sang, laughed, and vowed never to surrender. By October 31, 1940, the Battle of Britain was over. The Luftwaffe had lost nearly 2,000 aircraft, while the RAF lost about 1,000. But Britain still stood. The invasion was cancelled. Hitler turned his eyes east, toward the Soviet Union, a fatal mistake that would one day seal his downfall. Winston Churchill captured the moment in words that still echo through history: "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." The few, the RAF pilots, had saved the free world. On the dawn of June 22, 1941, the largest military invasion in human history began. It was called Operation Barbarossa. At precisely 3:15 a.m., more than 3 million German soldiers, backed by 3,500 tanks and 2,700 aircraft, crossed the Soviet border along an 1,800-mile front, without a declaration of war. The skies above Belarus, Ukraine, and the Baltics erupted in flames. The Nazi war machine had turned east. For months, Hitler had planned the invasion in secret, convinced that conquering the Soviet Union would give him the living space or Lebensraum he believed Germany needed. He saw communism and Slavic people as inferior, and sought to crush them in a lightning campaign before winter arrived. Stalin, despite numerous warnings from his intelligence network, refused to believe Germany would betray the Molotov-Ribbentrop pact signed just 2 years earlier. When the attack came, the Soviet forces were completely unprepared. In the first weeks, the Germans achieved astonishing success. Entire Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed. By early July, the Wehrmacht had advanced hundreds of miles, capturing Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev. Millions of Soviet soldiers were killed or taken prisoner. Nazi propaganda boasted that the war in the East was already won. But the vastness of Russia, its distance, its mud, and its brutal climate began to turn against them. As summer faded, Hitler's army pushed toward Moscow under Operation Typhoon. In October 1941, the rains turned the roads into rivers of mud. Tanks bogged down, trucks froze, and soldiers shivered in thin uniforms. When winter struck, temperatures plummeted to -40 degrees Fahrenheit. The Wehrmacht was unprepared for the cold, but the Soviets were not. Reinforcements arrived from Siberia, equipped for winter warfare. Under the command of General Georgy Zhukov, the Red Army launched a ferocious counterattack in December 1941, driving the Germans back from the gates of Moscow. Hitler's dream of a quick victory was over. Operation Barbarossa had failed. The Eastern Front would become a brutal, unending nightmare, a war of attrition that would devour millions on both sides. As the snows of 1941 settled over the Russian plains, it was clear Nazi Germany had awakened a sleeping giant. The tide of war was beginning to turn. While Hitler's armies battled the Soviets in the icy fields of Eastern Europe, another storm was brewing across the Pacific. The Empire of Japan, hungry for resources and dominance in Asia, had been waging war in China since 1937, as the United States imposed all embargoes and froze Japanese assets. Tokyo's leaders saw only one option: strike first, strike hard, and cripple America before it could stop them. At 7:48 a.m. on Sunday, December 7, 1941, Japan unleashed a surprise attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet anchored at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The morning calm shattered as hundreds of Japanese aircraft -353 bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters roared through the clouds. Within minutes, Battleship Row erupted in flames. The USS Arizona exploded after a bomb pierced its ammunition magazine, killing over 1,100 sailors instantly. The USS Oklahoma capsized, trapping hundreds inside. In less than 2 hours, -1 battleships, 3 cruisers, and 4 destroyers were damaged or sunk. Over 2,400 Americans were killed. The attack was devastating, but it was also a miscalculation. Instead of breaking America's spirit, it ignited it. The next day, on December 8, 1941, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed Congress, calling the event a date which will live in infamy. Within hours, the United States declared war on Japan. 3 days later, Germany and Italy declared war on America, fulfilling their Axis alliance. Overnight, the world's largest industrial power entered the global conflict. Factories across the United States shifted into overdrive. Car plants built tanks. Typewriter companies made machine guns. Men lined up to enlist, while women filled the factories as part of the new arsenal of democracy. America's entry transformed the balance of power. The Allies, Britain, the Soviet Union, China, and now the United States, formed a united front against the Axis. For the first time in history, war had become truly global. Battles would rage from the deserts of North Africa to the jungles of the Pacific. And in Berlin and Tokyo, the leaders who had once seemed unstoppable now faced a new enemy, one with the industrial might, manpower, and determination to fight until total victory. The world was entering its darkest and most decisive years. By the beginning of 1942, the Axis powers stood at their greatest reach. Nazi Germany controlled almost all of Europe, while Imperial Japan dominated the Pacific. Yet, beneath their triumphs, cracks began to form, cracks that would soon shatter their empires. The year 1942 would become the turning point of the entire war, marked by 2 decisive battles fought thousands of miles apart, Stalingrad and Midway. In the east, Hitler launched a massive summer offensive, Operation Blue, to seize the oil fields of the Caucasus and capture the city that bore Stalin's name, Stalingrad. The battle began in August 1942, and soon descended into one of the bloodiest confrontations in human history. Street by street, building by building, both armies fought in brutal close combat. Civilians were trapped in the ruins, with snipers lurking in every shadow. Soviet commander Vasily Chukov vowed, "There is no land beyond the Volga." By November 1942, Soviet forces under General Georgy Zhukov launched Operation Uranus, a massive counteroffensive that encircled nearly 300,000 German soldiers of the Sixth Army, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus. Hitler ordered them to fight to the last man, refusing to allow a retreat. By February 2, 1943, after months of starvation and freezing temperatures, the remnants of the Sixth Army surrendered. Over 2 million casualties were recorded on both sides. Stalingrad was in ruins, but it had broken the spine of the Nazi war machine. Meanwhile, on the opposite side of the world, another decisive clash unfolded. On June 4, 1942, Japanese carriers launched an attack on Midway Atoll, aiming to destroy what remained of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. But American cryptographers had broken Japan's naval code. Forewarned, Admiral Chester Nimitz set an ambush. In just one day, U.S. dive bombers destroyed 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, the same ones that had attacked Pearl Harbor. The Japanese Navy never recovered. Stalingrad and Midway, 2 names etched forever into history. One froze the German advance in Europe. The other shattered Japan's domination of the Pacific. From this point forward, the tide of war began to turn. The Allies were no longer fighting for survival. They were fighting for victory. In the spring of 1940, the Blitzkrieg strategy was tested once again, this time on a far greater stage. France. After months of what became known as the phony war along the Western Front, most of Europe believed the Maginot Line would protect France from any German invasion. But on May 10, 1940, Hitler launched his grand offensive. The Wehrmacht stormed into Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, forcing the Allied forces to rush north to defend those nations. It was a brilliant diversion. Meanwhile, the main German strength, 3 massive panzer groups led by Generals Guderian, von Kleist, and Reinhardt advanced through the Ardennes forest, a region most Allied commanders believed was impassable for tanks due to its dense trees and rugged terrain. For the first 3 days, the panzer divisions moved relentlessly, day and night, across narrow roads and fragile bridges with remarkable discipline. Allied command dismissed early intelligence reports of tanks moving through the forest as a mistake, but on May 13, 1940, Guderian's forces crossed the Meuse River near Sedan, supported by Luftwaffe air raids that obliterated French artillery positions. Within hours, France's defensive line collapsed. From that moment, Blitzkrieg once again proved its terrifying efficiency, fast, ruthless, and full of shock. Radio communication allowed an unprecedented level of coordination between units. German tanks spearheaded the assault, while motorized infantry followed to secure captured ground. Ru-87 Stuka dive bombers struck retreating columns, spreading panic and chaos. Behind the front lines, the French government began to lose control. Winston Churchill, newly appointed as Britain's prime minister, rushed to Paris to urge resistance, but morale was already shattered. By May 20th, Guderian's panzers had reached Abbeville, cutting off the Allied armies in Belgium from the rest of France. British and French troops were trapped on the beaches of Dunkirk. In less than 2 weeks, Germany had accomplished the unthinkable, conquering France through a route even Napoleon had never dared. The world was stunned not only by the speed of Germany's victory but also by the terrifying precision of its war machine, where technology, discipline, and propaganda combined to make every attack feel like an unstoppable storm of steel. By late May 1940, the Allied armies in northern France were trapped. The German spearheads had cut them off from the south, pushing nearly 400,000 British and French soldiers toward the coast at Dunkirk, a small port city near the Belgian border. The situation was desperate. Behind them lay the English Channel, before them, the unstoppable German panzer divisions. It was at this moment that Operation Dynamo was conceived. An audacious plan to evacuate the Allied troops across the Channel under constant enemy fire. The evacuation began on May 26, 1940, from the harbor and beaches of Dunkirk. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill warned that only about 45,000 men could possibly be saved, but the British public responded with extraordinary courage. Hundreds of civilian vessels, fishing boats, yachts, ferries, and lifeboats answered the call. They sailed from the English coast, through treacherous waters to rescue stranded soldiers. These little ships of Dunkirk became a symbol of unity and resilience, showing the world that courage was not measured in size or power. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe launched relentless air attacks to destroy the evacuation fleet. The skies over Dunkirk turned into a fiery storm as Spitfires and Hurricanes from the Royal Air Force clashed with German Messerschmitts and Stukas. On the beaches, chaos reigned. Columns of men waited for hours under bombardment, smoke rising from burning oil tanks, the sea turning black with debris. Yet, in the face of despair, discipline held. British and French troops formed orderly lines, helping the wounded and ensuring that as many as possible could board the boats. By June 4, 1940, the operation was complete. Against all odds, 338,226 soldiers had been rescued. Churchill called it a miracle of deliverance, but he reminded the nation, wars are not won by evacuations. The Battle of France was lost, but the spirit of resistance had been reborn. The evacuation at Dunkirk transformed humiliating defeat into a powerful story of survival and defiance, an emotional turning point that would later inspire Britain to stand alone against Hitler's war machine. As the last Allied soldiers sailed away from Dunkirk, France was left exposed. The once proud French army, weakened by weeks of relentless Blitzkrieg assaults, struggled to regroup. On June 5, 1940, Germany launched Case Red, the final phase of its invasion. The Wehrmacht surged southward across the Somme River, encountering little organized resistance. The French front collapsed like a broken dam. Refugees flooded the roads, families, soldiers, and children, carrying whatever they could as German tanks and bombers thundered overhead. Entire towns vanished beneath the dust of retreat. Inside Paris, panic grew by the day. The French government, led by Prime Minister Paul Reynaud, fled to Bordeaux, leaving the capital vulnerable. Meanwhile, the German advance accelerated. Cities such as Amiens, Rouen, and Reims fell one after another. The once impenetrable French defense crumbled with shocking speed. Even Charles de Gaulle, a young general who urged continued resistance, could not rally a collapsing command structure. The truth was undeniable. The Blitzkrieg had outpaced France's capacity to adapt. By June 10th, Italy, led by Benito Mussolini, declared war on France. Eager to share in Hitler's victories, now attacked from both the north and the southeast, France's fate was sealed. On June 14, 1940, German troops marched into Paris. The city was declared an open city to prevent its destruction, and the Wehrmacht entered without a single shot fired. The world watched in disbelief as Nazi soldiers paraded down the Champs-Élysées, beneath the Arc de Triomphe, to the echo of their boots striking the cobblestones. 4 days later, on June 18, from London, Charles de Gaulle broadcast his famous speech on the BBC, urging the French people to continue the fight from abroad. But in reality, France had fallen. On June 22, 1940, Marshal Philippe Pétain signed the armistice with Germany at Compiègne, in the very same railway carriage where Germany had surrendered to France in 1918. Hitler, filled with cruel satisfaction, deliberately chose that spot to humiliate his former enemy. France was divided, half under direct German occupation, the other under the collaborationist Vichy regime. Europe now lay under the shadow of the swastika. After the fall of France in June 1940, Adolf Hitler stood at the height of his power. Nearly all of Western Europe was under Nazi control. Only one enemy remained: Great Britain. Operation Sea Lion, the planned German invasion of the British Isles, could only succeed if the Luftwaffe first destroyed the Royal Air Force RAF and gained complete control of the skies. Thus began one of the most decisive air battles in history, the Battle of Britain, fought from July to October 1940. The Luftwaffe, led by Hermann Göring, commanded over 2,600 aircraft, including Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters and Heinkel bombers. The RAF, though outnumbered, possessed a critical advantage: the chain-home radar network, the world's first integrated air defense system. This technology allowed Britain to detect incoming raids long before they reached the coast, giving pilots precious minutes to scramble their Spitfires and Hurricanes into position. Every second mattered. The battle began in early July 1940, with German raids targeting British shipping and coastal airfields. By August 13, known as Adlertag Eagle Day, the Luftwaffe launched a massive assault to wipe out the RAF once and for all. For weeks, dogfights raged above southern England. The skies were filled with twisting trails of smoke, the thunder of engines, and the fiery descent of burning planes. British pilots, often flying multiple missions a day, were pushed to the limit. Churchill famously called them the few, saying, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." But Hitler's strategy faltered when British bombers struck Berlin in retaliation. An enraged Hitler ordered the Luftwaffe to shift its focus from airfields to London and major cities. The start of the Blitz. This gave the exhausted RAF time to recover. Despite relentless night bombings, Britain refused to break. Ordinary citizens sought shelter in underground stations, singing songs as bombs fell above. By October 31, 1940, the Luftwaffe had lost over 1,700 aircraft, failing to crush British resistance. Operation Sea Lion was postponed indefinitely. For the first time, Hitler's unstoppable war machine had been halted. The myth of Nazi invincibility began to crack, and the world realized that the tide of history could, indeed, turn. At dawn on June 22, 1941, the largest invasion in human history began, codenamed Operation Barbarossa. Over 3 million German soldiers, supported by 600,000 vehicles and 3,500 tanks, stormed across an 1,800-mile front into the Soviet Union. Without a formal declaration of war, the Axis powers launched a brutal surprise attack that shattered the uneasy Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact signed just 2 years earlier. Hitler's dream of Lebensraum, living space in the East, had begun, and with it, the war would enter a new, unimaginable phase of destruction. The offensive was divided into 3 massive army groups: Army Group North, driving toward Leningrad; Army Group Center, aiming for Moscow; and Army Group South, targeting Ukraine and the all-rich Caucasus. At first, the speed and ferocity of the Blitzkrieg overwhelmed Soviet defenses. Entire divisions were encircled and annihilated. Within weeks, hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers were taken prisoner. German troops captured Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev, advancing hundreds of miles into Soviet territory with astonishing ease. Hitler believed victory was certain before winter, but the Soviet Union was unlike any enemy Germany had faced. The sheer size of the land, the endless supply of manpower, and the unyielding will of its people soon turned the war into a nightmare. As German troops pushed deeper, supply lines stretched thin, and resistance stiffened. Villages were burned, and cities turned to rubble. Soviet partisans waged guerrilla warfare behind enemy lines, sabotaging railways and convoys. And as the Red Army retreated, they used the scorched earth policy, destroying everything of value so the Germans would find only ashes. By October 1941, army group center reached the outskirts of Moscow. The Wehrmacht seemed unstoppable, yet the Russian winter arrived early, with temperatures plunging to -30°C -22°F. Tanks froze, fuel solidified, and soldiers still wearing summer uniforms collapsed from frostbite. The Soviet counteroffensive, led by General Georgy Zhukov, smashed the exhausted German lines, pushing them back. For the first time, Hitler's army was forced into retreat. Operation Barbarossa had failed to deliver the quick victory Germany expected. Instead, it opened a front so vast and deadly that it would consume millions of lives. The war that began as a lightning strike had now turned into a grinding inferno, one that would eventually burn the Third Reich to ashes, while battles raged in Europe and the Pacific. Another crucial theater of World War II unfolded across the sun-scorched deserts of North Africa. By 1942, the war in this region had become a strategic struggle for control of the Suez Canal, vital oil supplies, and Mediterranean access. The German Afrika Korps, led by Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox, advanced relentlessly, demonstrating tactical brilliance and daring maneuvers. Opposing him was British General Bernard Montgomery, determined to halt the Axis advance and turn the tide in favor of the Allies. The campaign was marked by a series of dramatic confrontations. Rommel's forces, utilizing fast-moving panzer divisions and mechanized infantry, repeatedly outflanked and outmaneuvered the British Eighth Army. In battles such as Gazala and Tobruk, the desert sands ran red with the blood of thousands of soldiers, and victory seemed always just within Rommel's grasp. His ingenuity in supply lines, night attacks, and feigned retreats made him a formidable adversary, earning both admiration and fear from friend and foe alike. Montgomery, however, meticulously rebuilt the British forces after early defeats, focusing on morale, logistics, and combined arms coordination. By October 1942, Montgomery faced Rommel at the pivotal Battle of El Alamein. The desert became a crucible of strategy and endurance. Montgomery deployed entrenched infantry, coordinated artillery barrages, and massive tank formations to create an unbreakable defensive line. Rommel attacked repeatedly, but the Allies held firm. For the first time in months, Axis momentum faltered. The climax came when the British launched a powerful counteroffensive, shattering Rommel's lines and forcing a retreat westward. El Alamein became a symbol of resilience and determination, famously summed up by Churchill, "Before Alamein we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat." The victory opened the way for the Allies to invade Italy through Sicily, changing the dynamics of the European front. The North African campaign demonstrated that war was not solely won by speed or cunning. Logistics, preparation, and morale were equally decisive. The desert, a harsh and unforgiving arena, became a proving ground for both leadership and strategy. Montgomery's victory over Rommel not only halted the Axis advance but signaled a shift in the global conflict, proving that the Allies could reclaim the initiative. North Africa had been a testing ground for modern warfare, and the lessons learned there would shape the battles to come in Europe. On June 6, 1944, the world witnessed an audacious and unprecedented military operation, Operation Overlord, known to history as D-Day. Over 156,000 Allied troops from the United States, Britain, Canada, and other nations stormed the beaches of Normandy, France, facing entrenched German defenses that included artillery, machine guns, and barbed wire. The invasion was the culmination of years of planning, deception, and coordination across land, sea, and air, aimed at liberating Western Europe from Nazi occupation. In the early hours, paratroopers and glider infantry were dropped behind enemy lines, tasked with securing bridges, disrupting communications, and confusing German forces. Thousands of soldiers were scattered across the countryside, facing fierce resistance and treacherous terrain. Meanwhile, the massive naval armada carried infantry, armor, and supplies across the English Channel, under constant threat from mines, U-boats, and coastal artillery. The beaches Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword became scenes of chaos, courage, and unimaginable sacrifice. Omaha Beach witnessed particularly brutal fighting. American troops faced steep cliffs and a hail of German fire. Many soldiers were killed or wounded before even reaching the shore, yet determination and leadership carried them forward. Engineers and medics braved the battlefield to clear obstacles and aid the injured. Naval gunfire and aerial bombardments gradually suppressed enemy defenses, allowing the Allies to establish beachheads. By nightfall, small pockets of territory had been secured. Though at tremendous cost, the success of D-Day relied not only on sheer force but also on meticulous planning. Operation Bodyguard, the deception campaign, convinced the Germans that the invasion would occur at Pas-de-Calais, drawing reinforcements away from Normandy. Air superiority, provided by the Allies' thousands of aircraft, limited German mobility and prevented effective counterattacks. Logistics, intelligence, and coordination ensured that reinforcements, tanks, and supplies flowed to the front lines, sustaining the assault beyond the initial landings. By the end of June 6, over 130,000 soldiers had landed, establishing a critical foothold in Western Europe. D-Day marked the beginning of the liberation of France and the push toward Germany itself. It was a turning point that demonstrated the Allied commitment, planning, and resilience. The courage displayed on the beaches of Normandy, in the skies above, and across the Channel would echo through history as a testament to the human spirit and the determination to defeat tyranny. The war, once again, had reached a decisive moment. In December 1944, as the Allies advanced toward Germany, Adolf Hitler launched one final desperate attempt to turn the tide. Operation Wacht am Rhein, known to history as the Battle of the Bulge, concentrating over 200,000 troops, 1,200 tanks, and thousands of artillery pieces. The Germans struck through the Ardennes forest in Belgium and Luxembourg, aiming to split the Allied forces and capture the port of Antwerp. Hitler hoped that a dramatic victory would force a negotiated peace in the West and allow Germany to focus on the Eastern Front. The surprise attack exploited poor weather and the inexperience of some Allied units. Dense forests and snow-covered roads slowed reinforcements, while fog grounded Allied aircraft, giving the Germans initial air superiority. American soldiers, many of them fresh recruits, faced ferocious attacks in freezing conditions. Villages such as Bastogne became epicenters of resistance. Surrounded and outnumbered, the 101st Airborne Division held the town, famously responding to German surrender demands with General Anthony McAuliffe's terse reply, "Nuts." For over 3 weeks, intense fighting raged. Tanks clashed on icy roads, artillery barrages flattened towns, and infantry endured frostbite, hunger, and relentless enemy fire. The battle produced some of the heaviest casualties of the war for the United States, with nearly 19,000 Americans killed and tens of thousands more wounded or captured. Despite the shocking intensity, the Allies demonstrated resilience, slowly stabilizing the front lines and regrouping to mount a counteroffensive. By late January 1945, the German advance had been halted and pushed back, the failure of the Ardennes offensive exhausted Germany's remaining reserves, and marked the last major German offensive in the West. Hitler's gamble had failed catastrophically, leaving the Reich vulnerable from both East and West. The Allies now held the initiative, moving steadily toward the heart of Germany. The Battle of the Bulge highlighted both the extremes of human endurance and the strategic importance of logistics, intelligence, and leadership. It demonstrated that even when surprised and outnumbered, disciplined forces could withstand tremendous pressure. More than a military confrontation, it became a symbol of determination, courage, and the eventual collapse of Nazi ambitions. The winter of 1944-1945 proved that the end of the Third Reich was inevitable, setting the stage for the final Allied push into Germany itself. By April 1945, the Allies were closing in from both East and West. The Soviet Red Army had pushed relentlessly through Eastern Europe, while American, British, and French forces advanced from the West. The heart of Nazi Germany, Berlin, stood isolated and surrounded. Adolf Hitler, now entrenched in his bunker, faced the collapse of the regime he had built over 12 years. The city's defenders, composed of exhausted soldiers, Hitler Youth, and Volkssturm militias, prepared for a battle they could not hope to win. On April 16, 1945, Soviet forces under Marshal Zhukov launched the final assault on Berlin. Intense artillery barrages flattened entire neighborhoods, while air raids targeted remaining military positions. Street by street, building by building, the fighting was brutal. Civilians were caught in the crossfire, with thousands killed, injured, or displaced. The once proud German capital became a battlefield of fire, smoke, and rubble. Despite desperate resistance, Soviet forces advanced inexorably. Inside the bunker, Hitler realized the war was lost. On April 30, 1945, he committed suicide, leaving Karl Dönitz as his successor. The bunker, a symbol of the regime's final days, became a tomb and a testament to the collapse of Nazi ideology. Meanwhile, German commanders in Berlin attempted surrender negotiations with the Soviets, recognizing that further resistance would only prolong civilian suffering. By May 2, 1945, Soviet forces had fully secured Berlin. Across Germany, remaining Nazi forces surrendered to the advancing Allies. On May 7, General Alfred Jodl signed Germany's unconditional surrender at Reims, France, officially ending the war in Europe. May 8 became celebrated as Victory in Europe that day, a moment of immense relief and triumph for nations devastated by 6 years of global conflict. The fall of Berlin marked not only a military victory but the symbolic end of tyranny in Europe. Cities lay in ruins, millions of lives were lost, and the horrors of the Holocaust were revealed to the world. Yet from this devastation arose the hope of reconstruction, reconciliation, and a new international order designed to prevent such global destruction from recurring. The Third Reich, which once seemed unstoppable, had been defeated through courage, strategy, and the unity of the Allied nations. History had reached a turning point, and the world would never be the same again.